Okay, yes. Thank you for coming. I'm Ian Fish, and as it says there, I'm the chair of the BCS Information Security Specialist Group. So you might wonder why I'm talking about crisis management, but I shoved a couple of extra qualifications there. I'm a member of the BCI Business Continuity Institute, I'm one of those rare beings who has only two numbers in my membership number. I'm also a member of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management, which was an outfit which came out of academia, out of Hatfield University some time ago when they were running those sort of courses. So that's me. What I'm going to talk about is not just crisis management. You might wonder why I would be talking about that. Well, perhaps not so much now as incident response, crisis management, disaster management is becoming ever more topical in the cybersecurity field. But also I had been in the past the head of business continuity and crisis management for a major bank before it was taken over by a smaller bank, so you can probably guess which one it was. And I've also since then been consulting in a lot of crisis management areas, including in the liquid natural gas industry, in manufacturing industry, in defense, and in central government, and in finance. So that's me. So what I'm going to talk about, though, is, although I'm not just going to talk about crisis management, I'm going to try and center it in risk management as a whole, because I see it from that point of view, from a top-down, not a bottom-up point of view. So, if you have an organization over here on the, if I can get this thing to work, there it is. If you have an organization which is subject to, these are threats, then it is, you have threats from external, you have threats from internal, inside the organization, and they may lead to risks. They'll only lead to risks if you're actually vulnerable to those threats, or if they are actually threats to something that you actually do. Which brings me to one of my first points about risk. A lot of people seem to think that you can reduce risk to zero. You can't, unless you stop doing whatever it is the risk is attached to. So there'll always be some level of risk, and this becomes important later on. So what do? Well, this here, this red thing in the middle, well, not quite in the middle, is actually an incident or a crisis or a disaster that's happened. Now, back in the early days of the Business Continuity Institute, in their first version of their guidelines, they had a thing which was very difficult to say called ICD, Incident Crisis Disaster Management, and they talked about that. They dropped it after that because it was such a horrible, difficult thing to talk about. But actually, it's very important, because what you need when you're talking about managing incidents, crises, or disasters is something which enables you to deal with an incident and stop it becoming a crisis, hopefully. Or if it does become a crisis, or if it starts as a crisis, the system needs to be able to deal with that. The process you've got in place needs to be able to deal with that and stop it becoming a disaster, hopefully. But if it does become a disaster or starts as a disaster, for instance, a major natural occurrence or a major war or something like that, then you have to be able to deal with that. So the system needs to be able to, so it is actually a useful construct. Nowadays they just call it crisis management, but actually you need to take care of all those factors. So what can you do before any event happens? What can you do to mitigate those risks? So in this one here, there we are, we have a number of ways you can do it. You have plans. You have BC and DR plans. Now, BC plans are somewhat slightly different for DR plans, because the BC plans will enable you to function regardless of what happens to your systems, your critical systems, your critical processes. DR plans are more specific because they're all about recovering actual IT. Then you have your, and I've used it now, incident crisis disaster plans. Now both of these, DR plans are not generic, but BC plans and ICD plans need to be generic and easily usable, which is not something that a lot of them are quite often. I'll give you a tale about one organisation I went into which was regulated and was required therefore to have incident management exercises annually. They asked me to conduct an incident management exercise. I went in and they showed me their processes for managing incidents. The pile was about that high if you put it on the floor of paper. So I said, how on earth are you going to manage an incident using that? They said, well, we can't. It doesn't go very well. Because what you need is short, sharp, simple ways to manage it and as generic as possible. Then, of course, there's the area of risk reduction. You never reduce it to zero, remember, except by stopping doing it, which is an option, of course. But there's risk reduction. And then there's the wonderful risk transfer, which usually means one of two things to most organizations. The first is insurance, obviously. But unless you're a very big organization, I would suggest that you probably get your insurance probably sometime after you've gone out of business. And it might help pay off some of your creditors. As for the other type of risk transfer, which is to outsource and things like that, although that might transfer some of your risk, it doesn't transfer the risk to you as the risk owner. So you still have reputational damage possible, things like that. GDPR actually is an interesting version of the idea of this, because GDPR has taken care of that idea of outsourcing, i.e. controller-processor relationship. They're saying the processor can no longer get away with it. You know, they still have the risk, but it recognizes, conversely, that you still have the risk as the controller of the data in that case. So there's all these things you can do. Now, let's have a look at risk reduction a bit more to start with. So risk reduction, what that implies is that you have made a decision as to what an acceptable level of risk is. You hear the terms often risk appetite and acceptable levels of risk and such like things. So what actually happens in a risk reduction exercise is that you start from the risk that you actually have, assuming you can quantify it, or not quantify it, but express it properly. And you come up with an appetite that says, I want to reduce the risk to this. You then look at the cost of it. What happens? You find that you can't really afford to go that far down to what you think your risk appetite is, so you go a little less far. So you end up with a residual risk, which you're accepting, even if it's in advance of your risk appetite as an organization. So, how many people here have found a situation where a risk occurs that has been accepted because there's been some risk reduction put in, and when it occurs, the people at the very top of the organisation say, why is that occurring? I should think that's fairly common, because it sort of gets out of sight, out of mind. When you've reduced it to the level you consider to be acceptable, it's as if it's gone. And then there's a surprise when it does actually occur. But of course it is still a level of risk. It's a residual level. So, what are you going to do? Well, so the ICD plans, the Instant Crisis Disaster Plans, they include, it's not just plans, it's a bit more than that. So they include selecting crisis managers, making sure you have a structure in place for crisis management to take place, making sure that the people are trained and exercised. Now that also applies, of course, to business continuity disaster recovery plans. If you don't exercise, you might as well not bother. Same applies to crisis management plans. I'll call them that for the moment. But the other thing that's important for the incident crisis disaster thing is there's a huge problem in most plans that I've ever seen in going from incident to crisis. Because incident management is basically done by the people who are working at the time the incident happens. So, depending on what type of incident it is, they're dealt with, for example, by the IT department, who are working at the time it happens. Something happens and they try and do things in the normal way to try and isolate it, work out what it is, sort it out, and put it right. and if necessary, build up from backup again. But if it gets too big, that sort of approach might not be the best way for the business. So the whole field of how an incident escalates into a crisis and how you manage that escalation smoothly is very, very important. And that's a very, very important part of your plans for incident, crisis, disaster management. Because that escalation, if it's not handled right, means that the system that should be managing it as a crisis doesn't come into place soon enough. The crisis is worse. It may even have become a disaster. Must have been pretty close to that with TSB recently, I should think. But I had a very similar thing 20 years ago, very similar. And the same sort of problem happened, but luckily we caught it just before. But enabled me to then get a proper escalation in place. So, the incident happens, the disaster happens, the crisis happens. What do you do? Well, you have to implement the plans. I've already talked about the escalation from incident to crisis. But if you're in a full-blown crisis situation and you have your crisis system in place, with your crisis managers doing their thing, then how long does that go on for? So, the way I look at it is that the incident and crisis management only goes on for as long as it is still a crisis and you haven't got a way of resolving it. Once you've got a way of resolving it, the incident crisis management sort of starts to tail off, and the project management or program management to do something about it starts to take off and comes and crosses it, which gives you opportunities. Because even if the crisis has caused you a hell of a lot of problems, and say it's caused you to lose some of your processing, then, for example, this is just an example, but there will be opportunities there to do things better in future. If you had to rebuild something, you can do it better. You can learn those lessons, not just identify them, as is what normally happens. Normally after most things you go and do lessons learned, but it's actually only lessons identified. How often are they actually learned is a good question. So all that happens. So what does this mean for risk managers, for crisis managers? Do they have to be superheroes? Or can they be just you and me? Can they be an ordinary person in the business? Now, it has to be somebody in the business to start with, although there is a place for mentoring, I think, maybe. But that's a difficult thing to do because crises tend to come at inconvenient times. So any company offering mentoring would be in an interesting situation. But the crisis manager is not a superhero. But there are certain attributes that are needed from a crisis manager, for a crisis manager. And those include the ability to think calmly under conditions where you have imperfect information coming in, imperfect information available to you, often conflicting information available to you, often plain wrong information coming in, and also trying to manage the people who are trying to manage the actual correction of it at the same time. So the normal process, the way that people have been doing it now for 20 or 30 years probably, is using the police system of a gold commander, a silver commander and a bronze commander. The gold commander being strategic, the silver commander being tactical, and the bronze commander being operational, actually on the ground, doing things like, if it was a bomb, for example, moving people, clearing things, that sort of stuff. So that process has been used for a long time. But what actually makes somebody who can be, because the gold commander or the silver commander doesn't work on their own, they have a team, obviously. And that team might have to go on for quite a long time. What actually makes a good person to lead that team? So, I've found over the years that most people are perfectly good team members. I'll give you some rough percentages. Probably around about 60 or 70% of people in an organisation could be good crisis team members, as long as these other things have happened, as we'll see. These other things have happened, but there's probably only about 10%, maybe 15%, who are really good crisis team leaders. All these people in the middle can be crisis team leaders as well, but they're not sort of people you'd say are really good. And then there's probably 10% who just can't do it. It's just not their thing. Now that doesn't mean to say that they should be judged on that. It's just not their thing. They're just not that sort of person. When I first went to one organisation, their gold team leader was done on a post. So the person who held that post always did it. What that meant was that somebody who was in that bottom 10%, who was very, very good at his job in the organisation, extremely good because he got to that level, and he really did know what he was doing, just wasn't constitutionally suited to doing that team leadership, that crisis leadership role. And it was horrible. It really was. It was terrible. And then people started judging him on the basis of that. But that wasn't what he was there for. So you have to come up with a mechanism for selecting, training, exercising, and developing people into roles in crisis management in order to make sure that the selection doesn't disadvantage people's careers. So it has to be sort of voluntary. And the big difficulty with this, of course, is this would work fine in something like an armed service or the police force, where people are there for years and years and years in the same thing. That would work fine. You could select them, you could train them, you could develop them, you could exercise them on a regular basis. But in most businesses now, that's not the case, is it? Especially big businesses, you'll have people moving on all the time. So that's going to be very difficult. But somehow you've got to get people, when they're first starting out, self-selecting themselves for doing this. This is exciting. Well, maybe it's part of their graduate training or whatever it happens to be in an organisation. They then get trained. They then get exercised in junior roles in the team and developed, and hopefully at the end of it they will come out as people who can lead these teams. Because it's very, very important. You've seen a lot of crises recently, I would guess, in various government and non-government organisations, where people haven't covered themselves in glory as managing the crisis. And a lot of occasions that's down to the fact that they haven't been selected to do crisis management. They haven't been trained in it. Sometimes they get media training, but that doesn't necessarily give them what they need. Definitely they haven't been exercised, because running a big crisis management exercise is a very expensive business, and a lot of companies will try and sell you that because that's the only way you can really exercise the whole system together to make sure that it works. But in actual fact, there's quite a lot of value in tabletop exercises, which are run quite simply as well. It doesn't give you the full gamut of what's going on, but it does give you a feel, and it's amazing how involved people get in even those sort of very artificial exercises. So developed as well, that would be ideal, but as I said before, it's quite difficult. So what do you need for this to happen? Well, you need a crisis management structure. Now, the crisis management structure, as I alluded to earlier, must be as simple as possible, and it must consist of stuff that you can just pull and say, it's almost a checklist sometimes. As long as they've been trained, selected, trained, developed properly, it's almost a checklist. Have I done this? Have I done that? Have I done the other? You know, and go around a cycle every, whatever it happens to be. It depends what sort of industry or organisation you're in. But let's say it's something you need to look at every half hour to make sure that things haven't changed. So every half hour you go around that checklist. There will be other things as well, but you need a structure. The other thing you need is a structure to support you. You often find that crisis managers and their teams are not supported. They're trying to do it themselves. They're trying to take all the inputs themselves and sift them. that is not a good idea, because you'll find that 2 or 3 people in the team are dealing with the same issue, perhaps with slightly different information, or you just get overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the same information coming in. So you need a structure that actually supports and sifts that information before it even gets to you. Another expense, but it makes a huge difference in the heat of a crisis. And remember what I said, the heat of a crisis is that time up until it becomes like a project or a program to get things back to normal. The heat of a crisis is what matters. The other interesting thing in the structure is, what do you do about the gold team? Let's say you've got a crisis that carries on as a heat of a crisis for days and days and days. The gold team consists of very important people. And what you tend to find is that they start delegating because they've got important things to do to make other parts of the business still make money or run smoothly. So they start delegating, and they start delegating to the same level as is running the tactical team, the silver team. So you end up with basically bun fights between people at the same level trying to jostle for positions. So you don't need that. So you need to keep the gold team high, but you don't need to waste a lot of people's time in doing it. So the way to deal with this in the structure at the top there, in the top of the pyramid there, little wooden pyramid, is to have a single point, somebody who's at that sort of level, who understands across the business and is capable of acting as leader, who coordinates, who briefs the other people at that level, who brings them in when they're required to make a decision, in groups or singly as required. That's the way to deal with that, because the gold level often fails in large organizations. So I think I'm running out of time, but I haven't had anybody to ask me any questions yet, so let's get on to that. Because I realised I only had 25 minutes on this occasion. So happy to take any questions.
What's your view on the importance of collating near misses?
Oh, start again.
So what's your view on the importance of collating information on near misses in terms of crisis management?
I think it's absolutely vital, and it would be better. I mean, let's take the example from safety critical systems management. It's always been said in safety critical systems management that it's better if you collect that sort of thing across all players in the industry. For example, if it's nuclear, well, there's probably not that many players there, but it's oil and gas or something like that. And I think the same thing applies to, for example, cybersecurity, to privacy management, to information risk generally, and all types of risks. So yes, near misses are vital, but I think there are certain areas of some organisations where they're not going to share that sort of information, even internally. But it would be ideal if it was done, yes. And the safety critical industries are the sort of model there, which we should be following. That also, of course, leads on to the idea that you might want a non-punishable sort of regime, which I think is absolutely vital, especially in the cybersecurity regime. If somebody becomes aware of something, they shouldn't think it's going to cause them any trouble to raise it up the channel. Preferably, if it's something to do with, there has to be routes that go round their bosses and things like that if there are real problems, especially if it's an ethical issue as well.
So any other pressing questions for Ian? I realise we're probably out of time on this one, but any more? We done? In which case, thank you very much, Ian, for the presentation.